As soon as you move down, we can start. Welcome to the Harlem Culture Festival here in the heart of Harlem.
What time is it? You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
My responsibility was primarily to do the historical pods or historical beats that were happening between the concert footage. So while I had some agency with the footage, I helped with naming conventions, with organization. The footage was procured well before my involvement with the film. So for me, I was more important in helping to expand the story of what the concert was. So there's this beautiful concert happening, but it's happening in this really complex political environment and social environment and cultural environment that we really wanted to expand upon. So I'm there to help build those extra stories using Archive, some of it that's very well known and some of it that hadn't been seen as much before. So we tried really hard to look at that period in history that's been covered so well through the lens of the Black press and through the lens of Black neighborhoods. So that was sort of my involvement. It's getting through the Archive, having the Archive speak to that experience. It was interesting. When we started the production, we had no idea if it was going to be solely a concert film or how much Archive, extra Archive was actually going to be in it. So we really struggled to find that balance. And like any editing process, you kind of have to experiment a lot before you get there. So the direction for me was very nebulous, that nobody really knew what to do. So I just kind of went with my gut at the beginning, which was just to really explore 1969 and also to explore Harlem. We decided relatively early on that we wanted to stay quite local in Harlem. So I started to join Facebook groups about Harlem. I was reading articles and books, certainly, and also reading about the concert to find out what the sort of influences were for the concert. There was a book about the concert, so I referenced that book quite a bit to see names of people and things like that. Because of course, one of the first things we wanted to do was find out if other people, if there was third-party footage of the concert, which it turns out there was not very much, but we found one little bit on the day of the moon landing, which is a lot of people's favorite scene. So we found the concert in a CBS clip where CBS had visited the concert and asked attendees how they felt about the moon landing. It's a really beautiful scene. So when, in terms of research, I was kind of all over the map, like I often am. I'm trying to give them far more than they need. And again, in this case, without a lot of direction, I just kind of threw a lot of things at them. And that ended up being a good process because a lot of that stuff ended up in the film. With regard to the duration, I was there from the beginning. I was there in pre-production. They very smartly, as any production did, any production should, brought me on quite early in the process. So that I could be a part of helping to develop what this story would be. So it was even before the tapes were in-house or digitized, I was already beginning my work. And the intention was for me to be on for the duration of the project. Although there's an ebb and flow with Archive, right? So sometimes things were a little more intense and sometimes they were less intense. So some weeks I'd be working 5-day weeks and other weeks I would be doing a little bit less. I had a logger for about a month, but for the most part, at the beginning of the process, it was just me. Then COVID hit, production halted, So we started the process in about October of 2000, and COVID hits in March, and offices are shut down, and we try for about a week to figure out how to kind of do things. And it's a little, it was difficult at first, if we all can remember the beginning of COVID in 2020, which is forever ago at this point. But we tried to figure out how to do this thing remotely. And at that point, editing remotely was not such a normal thing as it is now. So we spent some time, I was throwing research their way, definitely, and continuing to do so. So from the beginning, I'm just like consistently dropping footage to them all the time. I'm communicating with the editor, trying to figure out what he would like to see more of. And then comes a point where they're like, okay, we're going to halt production altogether. And so I said, okay, fine. And of course I needed work. So I went off to work on a completely other project, and they came back in August, and I was pretty booked. So I called in my favorite AP, who's now a producer in her own right, Julia Lewis. And Julia came in, and together I was feeding her information, and she was just pulling things in and helping keep it organized. And then I was going to come back for licensing. And I came back in at the end. It was a complicated licensing process for a couple of different reasons, because during licensing, they continued to edit. There was a real push to get this thing done, a real push to get it done. But sometimes, you know, when you're licensing and things keep changing, it can be really complicated. So it was a really difficult licensing process. And also, one of the reasons it was difficult is because when you watch the film, it's edited so musically, which means it's inherently a lot of montages. And montages, as we all know in this field, are troublesome to tear apart to get at all the little requisite bits that we have to make sure to account for every single tiny bit. And in some cases, there were 3 or 4 pieces of archive within 2 seconds, you know? So, so we went all the way through, and we completed in about November of 2020. So all in all, it was about a year. The edit continued during that time when production was down. The edit continued, and that's kind of when they cracked what they wanted to do with it. They decided like, oh, okay, we want this to be mostly a concert film, but we really want to extract the feeling of the environment that allowed this concert to happen. So they cracked the code during COVID while the rest of us were not really on board. And then when we came back, we finished it together. For this particular film, we had a music supervisor. So I actually don't license the performances. And we didn't really use that many external performances. Now, in the beginning of the process, I had pulled, because again, we didn't know, was this going to be a story about all these different artists? Were we going to tell it, you know, was each story going to be about a different artist? We didn't know what we were going to do. So at first I was pulling performances from people from some of, you know, the big performance archives, historic films or retro or reeling in the years. And I was pulling all of these performance videos, but in the long run, we ultimately didn't use the music content from other performances. We were only using the stuff inside of the concert, the festival, Harlem Cultural Festival. So what that meant was that a lot of the material I was to do with music at all. So it's ironic in a music documentary that so much of what we licensed was kind of more news and cultural material than it was musical material. I will say that working in music documentaries, I'm doing one now, is a more difficult process altogether, if I could say. But for this particular film, that was less my problem, because the music supervisor was licensing the songs that were being performed on stage, and that was not my responsibility. I mean, look, every one of these things is difficult. It's hard to make something out of nothing, and that's something that we do, right? Or we make something out of things that don't exist in the way that we're trying to put them together. And I think that's always really hard, and every time I do it, I learn something new. In the process of this one, I actually changed my naming convention on my next project because there was some missing information I felt like I needed. So just to be very technical about it, I like to use really long naming conventions, and I made it even longer. That turns some people off, but a lot of editors, it turns out, really like it. And that's something that I changed a little bit, just in terms of like process and things like that. I also, learning to work remotely was a change for all of us across the industry. And there was something really interesting about that. There were some things I resisted that ultimately now I embrace on a daily basis. Certain ways of passing things around, or using clip viewing where the editors or the something like Frame.io where they can leave comments. So there are things like that that I learned in a more philosophical sense. Because we learn things sort of on that fundamental level, but then like philosophically, you kind of take something different. I realize philosophically that even when things are hard, that I have to show up for that process and just get through it and get it done. And this was a real test of endurance, but also grit. Like, can I complete this project? And we did it, and it's great. It's a beautiful film. It was really hard to make, and again, I think a lot of things really are, and inherently, just again, because of COVID and things like that, made it harder. But also, I think that difficulty in some ways made it a lot. Embracing also that things that are hard are often still really good, and that the process that you experience going through creating a film is not necessarily reflective of how good the product is at the end. We really ended up using more sort of libraries and news archives for the parts that I did. So, the private collector inherently is Hal Tulchin, who was the producer of this film and who made it very difficult to license this film and to get this film made. He's since passed, but he was the private collector, and it was that collection that made this film what it was. Those negotiations were done over decades through the hands of many, many people. And I was not involved in that. And that this footage passed through so many hands before it ended up with us. So that is its own really complicated story that is political and loaded and super interesting, but somebody should just write a book about that. As far as what we did, I'm trying to think if we were looking at some shows that were produced, because we were trying to do Black media. We really wanted to tell the story not simply through white media. So there was a show called that was aired on WNET, and so we tried really hard to use that news as our source of speaking what was happening in the day. But again, that's not a private collection, that's WNET. I'm struggling to think of anything really that was obviously we had from the participants, we had some of their things, but we really didn't tap into anything super private or personal for the parts that I was responsible